The pilot was turning back. 39 hours in the Atlantic and nothing on any instrument. Then the dog stood up. They pulled a man from the water, hands locked around something he had refused to release. What he was holding could bring down an entire network of people who believed he was already dead. Stay with me, because some truths can only be found by those still willing to look. Summit Ridge Medical Center did not look like a place where anything went wrong. That was the first thing Jessica Ward noticed when she pulled into the visitor lot at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, Rin's breath fogging the rear window of the government-issued Tahoe, the November sky the color of old concrete. The facility was 4 stories of glass and pale stone, the kind of architecture designed by someone who understood that patients arriving scared needed their first impression to be the opposite of scary. Clean lines, mature trees along the walkway, automatic doors that opened without a sound. The parking lot was full by 8. This was a place where people trusted the lights stayed on. Merrick had called at 6, not texted. Called, which meant either he was already at the office or he hadn't slept. And with Merrick, the distinction didn't usually matter. The tip had come through the healthcare fraud hotline 11 days ago, anonymous, specific enough to flag for follow-up, but not specific enough to escalate. Abnormal surgical referral rates, spinal procedure volumes inconsistent with regional patient demographics. Probably a billing irregularity, he'd said. Probably nothing. Jessica had written down probably on the notepad beside her bed and said she'd be there by 8. She wasn't sure why she wrote it down. She did it anyway. Rin came out of the back seat the way he always did, all 4 feet on the ground before she finished opening the door, a quick survey of the lot, then his attention settling on her face for instruction. 4 years old, 72 pounds, the particular arrangement of black and gold that stopped people on sidewalks to ask if they could pet him. She never said no. He tolerated it with the dignified patience of a professional who understood that public relations were part of the job. With me. He fell into step on her left. The resident who walked her through the software hadn't been there long enough to know what to be careful about. He was 27 and genuinely proud of the system, the way people are proud of things that actually work. He pulled up a patient record, anonymized, he was careful to say, and walked her through a standard intake workflow. 11 minutes. Jessica watched the screen. The clinical pathway optimizer appeared at the 3rd decision point, framed inside the patient record interface the way a navigation prompt appears inside a map app. A sidebar, clean and white, with a progress bar and 3 small icons indicating evidence level. Based on this patient's reported symptom duration, age, and prior treatment history, clinical literature supports evaluation for surgical intervention. Recommended orthopedic consultation. Below it, a single blue button, Generate Referral. It doesn't make the decision, the resident said. He said it the way people say things they've been told to say so many times the framing has become indistinguishable from their own thought. It just surfaces the relevant literature. The physician still decides. Jessica looked at the button. What's the acceptance rate, she said, when the tool generates a referral recommendation? How often do physicians follow it? He had to look that up. When the number appeared on the screen, he seemed briefly surprised by it. Jessica wrote it in her notebook and moved on. Maria Delgado's room was on the 2nd floor of an assisted living facility 3 blocks from Summit Ridge. She'd moved there 14 months ago. The room was tidy in the way of people who maintain tidiness as a form of control over spaces where they have very little of it. A wheelchair beside the bed, a window with a view of a parking structure, a photograph of a young woman on the nightstand that Maria didn't look at while they talked. She'd agreed to meet. She hadn't agreed to anything else. Rin sat when Jessica sat. He looked at Maria without staring, the relaxed attention of an animal in a room where nothing required alertness, which was its own kind of alertness. Jessica had read the file, the surgery, the complication, the NDA. She didn't say any of that. She said, "I appreciate you seeing me." Maria looked at her for a moment, Then she looked at Rin. "He always this quiet?" "Usually." Outside, a delivery truck backed into the parking structure. The sound came through the window muffled and ordinary. "I signed papers," Maria said. "You understand that?" "I do." $340,000. She said the number the way people say numbers that have stopped feeling real from being thought about too many times. "My daughter was 19. I wasn't going to leave her with that." Jessica didn't respond. Sometimes the right answer to what someone has said is to let it stay in the air long enough to be real. The computer told him I needed it. Maria said it flatly. The way you state a fact you verified and re-verified until the act of saying it has become ordinary. That's what he told me afterward, when I asked why. He said the system flagged me as high risk if untreated. She looked at the window. I asked him if he agreed with the system. He said the system was based on the best available evidence. She didn't say anything else. After a moment, she reached down and touched the top of Rin's head. Just once, brief, the contact of someone who needed to touch something that wasn't going to ask anything of her in return. Rin accepted it without moving. Jessica thanked her and left. In the elevator down, she stood with her notepad and did not write anything. The records annex was at the end of the East Corridor, past radiology and a small family waiting area with a wall-mounted television playing a cooking show on mute. Jessica had the warrant for audit terminal access. The IT liaison walked her to the correct workstation and then stood slightly too close for slightly too long before she looked at him in a way that communicated he could go. Rin stopped walking. Not a command stop. There was no hand signal, no word. He simply ceased forward motion the way a pendulum stops, complete and unhurried and without drama. His ears came forward. His weight shifted to his front feet. He was looking at the door at the far end of the corridor. Plain gray, marked server access. Authorized personnel only, locked, nothing visible through the small square of reinforced glass in its frame. Jessica watched him for 2 seconds. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He sat, one fluid motion, haunches to the floor, and looked at the door with the absolute patience of an animal that had no reason to pretend it didn't see what it saw. She filed it. She didn't know yet what she was filing it under. She noted the door number in her notebook and turned back to the terminal. The deleted log entry was on line 2847 of the audit file. Timestamp 2:47 a.m., 11 days ago. The day after the anonymous tip was received, before it had been assigned to anyone, before her name had been attached to anything in the system. Someone had accessed the surgical referral records at 2:47 in the morning and removed a single entry. The removal itself was logged. The system logged everything. That was the point. But the content of the removed entry was gone. What remained was a gap with a timestamp and a user ID that resolved, when she ran it through the staff directory, to an account listed as inactive since the prior fiscal year, last accessed from an IP address registered to a third-party vendor whose contract with the facility had expired 6 months ago. Jessica looked at the gap for a moment. Then she saved the file to the encrypted drive and closed the terminal. Someone had known she was coming before she arrived. That narrowed things considerably. She met Dr. Holt in the hallway outside surgical scheduling. He was reviewing a chart and looked up when she approached, offered his hand with the easy confidence of a man who has learned that confidence reads as competence and has spent enough years in institutional settings where that is mostly true. He answered her questions clearly and said of course to the follow-up request, and my office will coordinate in the way of someone who has been coordinating with offices for a long time and understands how long it takes. When she turned to go, she heard him stop. Not a footstep, just a beat of stopped motion, the way you hear a person pause without actually hearing anything. She was already looking at her phone. She didn't see his hand come to rest at the edge of the nursing station counter, where a manila folder sat in the out tray. She didn't see the name on the tab, printed in standard 12-point font. Cole, Daniel J. /status, closed /D/O, O 9-14. She didn't see him look at it, then look away, then continue down the hall at the same unhurried pace as before. She was reading a text from Merrick. "How's it going?" 2 words, no question mark. "Fine," she wrote back. The field office was mostly empty by 9. Jessica sat at her desk with the case files on one screen and the audit export on the other, Rin under the desk near her feet, which was not regulation and was also simply how things were. The spinal procedure data ran across 24 months, 47 cases flagged in the initial screen, complications or mortality recorded in 31 of them. Rate 2.3 times the regional benchmark. She read them in order, each one a cluster of numbers that corresponded to a person who had walked into a building and trusted that the people inside would tell them the truth about what was wrong with them. The last entry on the list was dated 8 months ago. Cole, Daniel J. 24M, lumbar surgical intervention, post-operative complication, fatal. Next of kin, Cole, Marcus R. She stopped. She read it again. Under the desk, without being called, without reason, Rin's tail moved once against the floor. Jessica didn't look down. She kept reading. Chapter 2. 39 hours. The call came through the field office at 2:15 in the afternoon, routed from the Coast Guard liaison desk to healthcare fraud because of a name that appeared on a passenger manifest. Axis Care Solutions, flagged in a financial subpoena Jessica had pulled 3 weeks ago as part of the Summit Ridge intake records review. The charter vessel Meridian had appeared in Axis Care's corporate travel records. 6 documented offshore meetings over 18 months, contract signings conducted in international waters. Maritime fraud jurisdiction fell to the FBI when the underlying scheme involved healthcare billing. That was the legal basis. Merrick approved the request in under 4 minutes, which was fast enough that Jessica sat with the approval notification for a moment before she forwarded it to her field kit checklist. Fast enough to mean either he hadn't looked at the manifest carefully or he had. She didn't decide which. She loaded Rin into the Tahoe and drove to the Coast Guard station. The helicopter was a medium-range rescue bird, crew of 4 plus the liaison agent and her K-9. The crew chief, a woman named Okafor, with the economical movements of someone who had been boarding people onto aircraft in adverse conditions for a long time, showed Jessica the K-9 harness anchor point without being asked, which Jessica appreciated. Rin inspected it, accepted it, and moved to the window seat the way he moved to every window seat in every moving vehicle he had ever been in, with complete unself-conscious priority, as though this had always been his spot and the window had been waiting. Jessica sat across from him and tightened the hair tie around her wrist. Once, twice. The rotors built to pitch and the aircraft lifted. She did not look out the window during takeoff. The pilot's name was Reyes. He briefed them over comms once they'd cleared the coastline. Storm system had moved through overnight. Debris field approximately 11 nautical miles offshore. Mixed material consistent with a mid-size pleasure or charter vessel. No distress signal had been received. The field had been flagged by a commercial shipping crew who'd reported it that morning. Standard sweep pattern, 40-minute flight time out, visual confirmation, photographs, return. Probably storm debris, he said. These fields move. Could have originated 100 miles north. Jessica noted the word probably in her notebook. She was starting to collect them. The Atlantic in November is a particular kind of gray that has nothing to do with weather. It is a permanent gray, the gray of deep water that has decided the surface is not where anything important happens. Below them, the swells ran at a consistent angle, and the whitecaps moved across the field of view with the mechanical regularity of something that had been running on the same schedule since before anyone was there to observe it. Rin watched it all from his window, with his ears slightly forward and his breath leaving faint circles on the glass. The debris field appeared on the horizon as a loosening, a disorder in the pattern. pieces of material that moved at wrong angles to the swells, catching light differently. Reyes brought them lower and began the first pass. Nothing. Wood and fiberglass and what looked like a length of marine rope. A section of hull, white, no visible markings from altitude. Okafor photographed it. They completed the pattern and Reyes banked for the return heading. "Ready to head back, Agent Ward?" Jessica looked at Ryn. He was standing. He had been sitting when she last checked, 30 seconds ago. 40, she wasn't certain. He was standing now, and the standing was different from restless movement, different from the shift of an animal adjusting its balance in a moving aircraft. Both front feet were planted. His ears were forward and still. His head was angled down and slightly left toward a section of the debris field they had already passed over, where a hull section rode the swells at a low angle to the water, gray-white against gray-green, nothing that the thermal camera had flagged, nothing that the crew chief's binoculars had singled out from the rest. He did not bark, he did not move toward the door. He simply stood with his full attention organized around a single point on the water below, the way a compass needle stops when it finds what it was built to find. "Circle back," Jessica said. "Ma'am, the thermal readings don't indicate—" "I know what the thermal readings show." She was still watching Ryn. "Circle back," a pause on the comms. Then Reyes banked. They came in lower on the second pass, 40 feet above the surface, close enough that the downdraft from the rotors disturbed the top layer of the swells. Okafor had the door open. The hull section was larger from here, maybe 14 feet of midship, riding low on the left side, and across its surface, in the space where the shadow of the aircraft moved and the light was poorest, a shape that was not fiberglass. "I've got a person," Okafor said. He was on his back across the hull section, one arm trailing in the water, the other bent across his chest, the hand closed around the strap of a pouch. Dark material, sealed, flat against his sternum. His face was turned slightly upward. His lips had the color that cold water gives to living things before it decides whether to let them stay that way. His eyes were closed. Okafor went in. She crossed the distance in under 2 minutes and reached for him, and the moment her hand touched the pouch strap, his eyes opened. He didn't startle. He didn't grab for her. He looked at her the way people look at things when they're deciding whether the thing is safe, a complete, unhurried assessment that lasted approximately 2 seconds and took in the wetsuit and the tether line and the aircraft above and something in her posture or her face that resolved the question in one direction. He let her take hold of him. He did not let go of the pouch. Getting him onto the cable took 4 minutes. His core temperature, Okafor reported on the way up, was low enough that she couldn't get a clear reading on the field equipment. His grip on the strap did not loosen at any point during the ascent. Inside the aircraft he was conscious and he was not confused, which was the thing that made the medic, a young petty officer named Castillo, pause for a beat before beginning his assessment. Castillo had pulled people from cold water before. Exposure at this duration produced a specific quality of response. Slow, distant, the words arriving in the wrong order. This man's eyes tracked the aircraft interior clearly. He was cold in the way of someone whose body had made its decisions about what it was going to give up and had simply been waiting for the situation to change. He looked at Ryn first. Ryn had moved to the space beside him the moment the aircraft door closed, not to the anchor point, not to Jessica's side, but to the floor next to where the man had been laid, and he sat there with his shoulder 2 inches from the man's arm, present without requiring anything in return. The man's voice, when it came, was wrecked from exposure, the words abraded down to their bare structure. Good dog. Ryn did not move. He did not need to. Castillo worked efficiently, layering thermal blankets, running the oxygen line. He reached for the pouch. A practical decision, inventory and access, the same motion he would have made for any piece of equipment attached to a patient. The man's hand tightened before Castillo's fingers reached the strap. Castillo looked at Jessica. She shook her head once. "Leave it." He left it. He continued his assessment around the pouch as though it were a feature of the patient's anatomy, which, at this point, it functionally was. Jessica turned to the window. Below, the debris field had already moved, the swells carrying it south at the rate swells carry things, patient and indifferent, the hull section that had held him already separating from the rest, riding lower as it took on water. In another hour, it would be gone. In another 2, the field would have dispersed enough that no one sweeping for it would know what it had contained. She had not circled back the first time. She thought about that. Behind her, Rin sat beside the man in the thermal blankets and did not move for the entire flight back. There was no seat for him there. There was no command that had put him there. He had simply gone where he was needed in the way that, Jessica had come to understand in 4 years of working with him, was not sentiment and was not training, but something that sat in the narrow space between the two where the explanation ran out and the fact of it remained. She looked at the man's hand on the pouch strap. Pale from the water, the knuckles blanched, the grip maintained with the specific economy of someone who had already decided what they were willing to lose and what they were not. Cole, Marcus R. The name had been a line at the bottom of a document 12 hours ago, next of kin, a footnote. The kind of entry that meant someone was waiting for a phone call they didn't know was coming, or had already stopped waiting for one that never came. She understood something about him now that she had not understood from a file. He had not survived 39 hours in the North Atlantic because he was fortunate. He had survived because he had decided what he was holding on for and had refused at every point when the water offered him an easier way out to change his mind. She didn't know yet what was in the pouch. She knew it was the reason he was alive. The coast appeared on the horizon, and Rin stayed where he was, and the man in the thermal blankets kept his hand where it was, and Jessica turned back to the window and watched the water give way to land. The waiting room outside the Coast Guard medical bay had 4 plastic chairs and a vending machine that had been out of order long enough that someone had taped a handwritten note to it. Jessica sat in the chair closest to the door and did not look at her phone. Rin lay 6 feet away with his chin on the floor and his eyes open, his body oriented toward the closed door, the particular rest of an animal that is not sleeping, only waiting for the situation to resolve itself in one direction or another. She had been there 40 minutes when the door opened. Marcus walked out the way he'd looked on the helicopter, present in a way that didn't match what his body had been through. The thermal blanket was gone. Someone had found him a sweatshirt and a pair of borrowed pants that were slightly too short. He looked at Rin first, then at her, and said, "Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't here?" It wasn't a question. There was a break room down the corridor, empty at this hour. A table, a coffee machine that worked, fluorescent light that flickered once and then held. Marcus sat across from her, both hands around a paper cup, and told her about Danny, the way you tell something you've rehearsed in your own head so many times the words have worn smooth. No stumbling, no circling, no room for the emotion to find a handhold. 24 years old, he said. Rear-ended at a stoplight. Soft tissue, nothing structural. He saw 2 physicians before Summit Ridge. Both said conservative treatment. Physical therapy, rest, time. A pause, not for feeling, only for sequence. He didn't feel better as fast as he wanted to. He found Summit Ridge online. The intake process moved quickly. Within 6 weeks of his first appointment, Dr. Holt was recommending surgery. Jessica wrote in her notebook. The fluorescent light held. Danny trusted doctors, Marcus said. He thought that was what you were supposed to do. He looked at the paper cup. He died on the table. Pulmonary embolism, a complication that could have been identified in pre-surgical screening if anyone had been looking for it instead of moving him through as efficiently as they were. The coroner listed it as a known surgical risk. The hospital sent a letter of condolence on letterhead. He set the cup down. He didn't need to be on that table. The words sat in the room and didn't move. What followed, he said, was 8 months that he'd tell her about now, so she didn't have to ask later. He'd started with the billing records, obtained through a combination of methods he wasn't going to detail, in a room with an FBI agent, which Jessica acknowledged with a brief nod. The referral pattern from Holt's practice pointed to a payment structure that didn't appear in any standard compensation agreement. A Delaware LLC was receiving quarterly transfers from a medical consulting group that had no staff, no offices, and no publicly visible clients beyond a registered agent in Wilmington. Jessica opened her laptop. She had the AccessCare financial subpoena files in a secured folder, pulled 3 weeks ago as part of the Summit Ridge intake review, cross-referenced since but not fully mapped. She opened the corporate structure appendix. Then she opened the records from Marcus's hard drive, which Castillo had handed her in a sealed evidence bag before she left the station, the pouch finally relinquished once Marcus had decided to relinquish it. The Delaware LLC appeared on both screens at the same time. Left screen, AccessCare Solutions corporate filing, third-tier subsidiary, incorporated the same quarter AccessCare signed its first Summit Ridge contract. Right screen, Marcus's financial trace, the same LLC name, the same registered agent address, the same Wilmington zip code. She looked at it without speaking. Then she set the laptop on the table between them so he could see. He looked at both screens. He said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, "You were already on this." "We came from different directions," she said. The LLC owned Meridian, he told her. He'd traced the vessel registration through a maritime database contact he wasn't going to name. Once he understood what Meridian was, a charter vessel used for contract signings in international waters, creating jurisdictional complications that could add 6 to 18 months to any federal prosecution timeline. He'd done what he'd been trained to do when you need information from a location you're not authorized to enter. He'd boarded her at anchor, 80 nautical miles offshore, at 2 in the morning. He'd found the partial hard drive in a document storage cabinet in the main cabin. He'd been 15 minutes from the water when the crew found him. 3 men, professionally calm. He said that quality told him everything he needed to know about who they worked for. They hadn't used a weapon. He'd thought about that later, in the water, for a long time. "A body with a gunshot wound offshore opens a Coast Guard investigation that morning," he said. "A man overboard is an accident. It takes considerably longer to become a federal matter." He looked at the 2 screens. They were right that I'd sink. 30-minute survival window by any standard calculation. He paused. I had the pouch in the hull section I'd used to approach the vessel. I changed the calculation. He said it as a fact about physics. Somewhere across the city, in a building with climate control and a view that cost what most people earned in a quarter, a man named Arthur Breen received a message through an intermediary he paid specifically to manage communications he didn't want traced to a device. A name, a location, a status. Marcus Cole, Coast Guard Medical Facility. Alive. Breen read it. His expression did not change. He said 2 words, and the intermediary left, and Breen turned back to the documents on his desk. Retrieved the drive. Her phone rang at 11:14. She stepped into the corridor. "How's the maritime angle going?" Merrick said, casual in the specific way of someone using casual as a register rather than a state. It was 11:14 at night. "We recovered a survivor from the debris field. He's being processed. Anyone we know?" "Not yet." She looked at the break room door. "Full update in the morning." A pause that lasted 1 beat longer than it needed to. "Good. Get some rest." She ended the call and looked at the screen for 3 seconds, his name still lit, the timestamp beneath it, and then put the phone in her pocket and went back in. It was past 1 in the morning when the field office went quiet enough to hear the ventilation system. Marcus had a temporary badge and a borrowed chair and was reading through the hard drive index on a secured terminal. Ryn was under the desk. Then he wasn't. She heard it before she turned, not a sound, more the specific quality of completion that happens when something has been done and is being concealed. She turned around. Rin was sitting in perfect form beside the desk, ears forward, gaze directed at a neutral point on the far wall, his posture communicating a deep and general interest in the room's architecture. On the chair across from her desk, where one of the night shift analysts had left half a chicken sandwich on a paper plate sometime around 7, the plate was empty. His mouth was clean. This appeared to have required some effort. Jessica looked at the plate. She looked at Rin. She looked at the plate. Rin maintained his relationship with the far wall. She turned back to her screen. It was the closest thing to levity the room had offered in 2 days, and she held it for exactly as long as she could before the open files pulled her attention back where it belonged. An hour later, without instruction, Rin moved from under the desk and put his head on her leg. Not urgently, just present, the way he was when a room had been holding something too long and needed someone to acknowledge it without making it any larger than it already was. She kept looking at the screen. Her hand came down and rested on top of his head. Across the desk, Marcus looked up from the terminal. "Does your brother," he said, "ever do something that you have to decide whether to tell him about?" The question arrived without preamble in the flat register he used for everything, and it wasn't asking what it appeared to be asking on the surface. "Yes," she said. Marcus nodded once. He looked back at the terminal. They didn't say anything else. After a while, she noticed Rin's breathing had gone slow and even, and she understood he had been asleep for some time without her registering the change. The hard drive was going to need 48 hours in the FBI lab. She'd made the call at midnight and written the number on the notepad beside her keyboard. She looked at the notepad. She looked at Merrick's name in her call log. Then she opened a new search window and typed the name she'd flagged 3 days ago from the Summit Ridge staff directory, Ryan Hartwell, IT Systems Administrator. The first result was the hospital employee page. The second was a LinkedIn profile with a last active date of 6 months ago. The third and fourth were withdrawn job applications. 2 different companies, both outside healthcare, both within the same 6-month window. Someone who had been trying to leave and hadn't been able to. She saved the results to the encrypted drive, closed the window, and sat with Rin sleeping and Marcus working, and the night outside doing what nights do, waiting without patience or impatience for whatever was coming to arrive. Access Care Solutions occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on the edge of the financial district, the kind of building that announces its own expense without appearing to try. The lobby had a reception desk made of a single piece of pale stone and a digital display cycling through client testimonials, hospital systems, regional health networks, a university medical center in the Midwest. Transforming clinical outcomes through intelligent decision support. The sans serif font was the color of a clear sky. Jessica showed her credentials at the desk. Behind her, through the lobby glass, Marcus sat in the passenger seat of the rental car they'd switched to that morning, reading a newspaper. Rin was in the back. When she'd gotten out, Marcus had said, "He won't sit still." He'd said it looking at Rin, not her. "Keeps watching the front entrance." She'd noted it without answering and gone in. The legal team was waiting on the 31st floor in a conference room with a view that made the city look like a schematic. 3 of them, which was one more than the subpoena warranted, which told her what the subpoena had told them. The lead counsel shook her hand with the measured warmth of someone who has spent a career calibrating warmth to the precise degree that communicates cooperation without conceding anything. They had prepared a demonstration. A live feed appeared on the conference room display. A physician's workstation at an unnamed partner facility, anonymized per HIPAA protocol, the physician's face-off camera, but his hands and screen visible in real time. The lead counsel explained, in the careful language of someone who had explained this many times, that the Clinical Pathway Optimizer was a decision support tool, not a decision-making tool, The distinction was important, and the company took it seriously. Jessica watched the screen. The physician moved through a patient intake record. The tool appeared at the third decision point, the same position she'd seen in the Summit Ridge demo, the same clean white sidebar, the same blue button. The evidence citations were formatted identically. The recommendation framing was identical. Clinical literature supports evaluation for surgical intervention. The button? Generate referral? She asked about the acceptance rate. The lead counsel said the figure varied by specialty and patient population, and they'd be happy to provide aggregate data within the parameters of the subpoena. Jessica said she'd like the configuration logs and the deployment specifications for the surgical referral recommendation module. The lead counsel said those files contained proprietary algorithm parameters covered under trade secret protections, and their counsel was reviewing the subpoena's scope before releasing anything in that category. "I have a subpoena," Jessica said, "which our counsel is reviewing." The lead counsel's tone did not change. "We expect to have a response by end of business tomorrow. We appreciate your patience." Jessica closed her notebook. She thanked them for their time. She was in the elevator before she finished the thought she'd started during the demo, the thought about what it meant that the tool looked exactly the same at every facility, that the recommendation appeared at exactly the same decision point, that the button was exactly the same shade of blue. Consistency was a feature. She understood now all the ways in which it was also something else. Marcus was still in the car. The newspaper was folded in his lap. Ryn was in the back seat with his nose pointed at the front entrance. "Marcus." "Anything?" "Jessica." "Tomorrow." He nodded. He picked up the newspaper. The expanded warrant for Summit Ridge's server room had come through while she was in the elevator. She drove. The server room was in the hospital's east wing, accessible through a maintenance corridor that smelled of cold metal and recycled air. The IT systems manager who met her at the access door was named Patterson. 40, efficient, no visible concern about why an FBI agent needed server room access, which either meant he had nothing to hide or he had been told by someone above him to present that way and was doing it well. He badged them in and offered to wait or to go, and Jessica said he could go, and he went. The room was cold in the way of rooms that exist to serve machines rather than people, a cold that had nothing to do with comfort, the temperature of controlled function. The server racks ran in 3 parallel rows, each one a wall of blinking indicator lights and vented panels, and the low, continuous sound of cooling fans that had been running so long the sound had become the room's baseline silence. The overhead lights were white and even, augmented by the blue-green status lights along the rack faces, so that everything in the room had 2 shadows. Jessica moved to the audit terminal on the east wall. She inserted the forensic drive. The terminal began pulling access logs. Ryn sat, not a sit she'd asked for. There was no word, no signal, no change in her posture that would have told him to. He had been moving beside her, his nails quiet on the raised flooring, and then he wasn't moving. His haunches went down with the particular deliberateness of a body that has made a decision it intends to hold, the weight of it landing in the cold air of the room like a full stop. The movement traveled up through the flooring in a way she felt rather than heard, the solid, planted finality of an animal that had found the thing it was looking for and was now simply indicating it for the benefit of whoever was paying attention. He was looking at the end rack, the last one on the right, against the wall, its indicator lights blinking in the same patient rhythm as all the others. He did not bark. He did not move toward it. Patterson had said, before he left, that the last rack contained legacy backup systems, decommissioned hardware, nothing active. He'd said it the way you mention something you don't expect anyone to care about. Jessica left the terminal running and walked toward the rack. Ryan Hartwell came out from behind it, the way frightened people emerge from the places they've chosen. not with the coordination of someone executing a plan, but with the unsteady motion of someone whose plan was to stay hidden and who has just understood that staying hidden is no longer an option. He was 31 years old, and he looked like a man who had been doing someone else's math for 3 weeks and had arrived at an answer he couldn't square with anything he'd been told to believe. He didn't run. He stood at the end of the rack and looked at Jessica, and then at Ryn, and then at the floor, and his hands moved to his jacket pockets the way hands move when they're looking for something to hold, and there's nothing. "I didn't know what it was for," he said, "when I deleted the log. My supervisor told me it was a compliance matter, that the entry had been made in error and needed to be removed before the quarterly audit." He stopped. I knew that wasn't right. I'd been in systems long enough to know what a compliance removal looks like and what it doesn't look like. His jaw moved. I did it anyway. She let him talk. What he'd deleted, he said, was a referral confirmation entry. The system's record of the moment the clinical pathway optimizer generated a surgical recommendation for a specific patient, and the recommendation was accepted. The entry shouldn't have existed in the form it was in, because the log showed the recommendation had been generated not from the patient's clinical data, but from a configuration flag set manually at the administrative level 3 days before the patient's first appointment. The tool had been pointed at the patient before the patient arrived. He'd kept a copy. He said it the way people say things they cannot fully explain to themselves, not with pride because it wasn't pride, and not with strategy because he hadn't had one. He'd made a second copy of the file before he removed the original and put it in an encrypted folder on a personal device he'd kept off-network since the day his supervisor gave him the deletion order. And he'd left it there for 3 weeks because he didn't know what to do with it and couldn't think clearly enough to decide, and because deleting it would have required him to make a choice he wasn't ready to make, and because not deleting it was a smaller choice that he could live with until the larger one became unavoidable. The encrypted folder also contained something he hadn't gone looking for: an email chain he'd encountered while performing a routine archive migration 8 months ago between Arthur Breen and Summit Ridge's medical director. Breen had reviewed and approved the surgical recommendation module's configuration parameters before each of the last 4 major updates. The emails were specific about thresholds, the clinical criteria below which the tool would still generate a referral recommendation. The thresholds had been adjusted in each version. Each adjustment moved them lower. He handed her the device. His hand was steady. She thought that probably took something. She was logging the device into evidence at the terminal when she became aware of someone at the far end of the corridor, beyond the server room's open access door. The maintenance corridor had a long sight line from the door to the junction with the main hallway, and at that junction, standing with a chart in his hand and his weight distributed in a way that meant he had stopped rather than arrived, was Dr. Holt. He was looking at Ryan, not at Jessica, not at Ryn. At Ryan with an expression that was not readable from this distance in any simple way, but that had in it something that resembled the look of a person who has been standing outside a room for a long time and has just seen, through the open door, that the room has already changed in ways that can't be changed back. He stood there for 4 seconds. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call out. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, at the same unhurried pace he used for everything, and the corridor swallowed him. Jessica watched the junction until there was nothing to watch. She noted the way he'd looked at Ryan and not at her, the way he'd turned without any particular urgency, the way he hadn't reached for his phone. She noted all of it, and filed it, and went back to the terminal. Her phone rang when she was walking Ryan to the access door. Merrick. She told Ryan to wait and stepped into the corridor. "I'm reassigning the case." His voice was flat and professional in the way of someone delivering a prepared sentence. "Maritime overlap with an ongoing investigation in the Southern District. Jurisdictional conflict. It goes up the chain from here." "Understood," she said. "Good work on the survivor recovery ward. That'll go in your file." "Thank you." She ended the call. At the far end of the maintenance corridor, through the window above the exit door, she could see the parking area. The rental car was there. Marcus was in the passenger seat, still looking toward the building the way he'd been looking at things for 8 months, with the specific patience of a person who has decided that patience is the only viable option remaining and has made his peace with what that costs. He looked up when she appeared at the window. He read her face from 30 feet away in the time it takes to understand something you were already expecting to understand. She held up 2 fingers. He looked at them. He looked at her. He nodded once and turned back to the parking lot and whatever he was thinking about, and she went back inside to finish logging the device and to decide in the next 48 hours what she was going to do with the fact that someone had known, again, what she was doing before she'd finished doing it. The formal reassignment came through at 9:17 the following morning in an email from Merrick's office that used the word jurisdictional 4 times and the word conflict 3 times and her name once in the subject line. The case was being transferred to the Southern District pending coordination with an ongoing maritime investigation. Her access to the Summit Ridge warrant materials would be revoked by end of business. She was to forward all case files to the transferring unit through the standard secure channel. She read it once. She forwarded nothing. She closed the email and opened the forensic copy she'd made of Ryan's device the night before on her personal laptop, before logging the original into evidence. The personal laptop was not a government system. It was not connected to any network Merrick's office had visibility into. It was a thing she owned, which meant what was on it was information she had come across in the course of her work and had not yet determined how to categorize. Her K-9 assignment had not been revoked. The paperwork for that would go through a different office and take longer, because paperwork for K-9 reassignments always took longer, because no one in the administrative chain ever prioritized them. She did not contact that office to expedite the process. She called Marcus and told him to pay cash for 2 nights at a motel, far enough from the field office that it wasn't the first place anyone would look and close enough to the highway that there was more than one way out. He said he knew a place. He paid for the room under a name that wasn't his, and she didn't ask how he had the identification for that, and he didn't explain it. Ryn investigated the room with professional thoroughness, under both beds, behind the bathroom door, the closet, and then stationed himself at the window with his nose an inch from the gap in the curtain, observing the parking lot below with the focused disinterest of a security professional on a long shift. The car burned at 2 a.m. She woke to Ryn already at the window, not barking, just standing with his body rigid and his attention fixed on a point below. Marcus was in the chair by the door, also awake. She understood, watching him, that he hadn't been asleep. The fire was in the far corner of the lot, the rental they'd moved to after the parking garage. It burned with the even, complete efficiency of something that had been started correctly, without excess accelerant, without the kind of dramatic speed that drew immediate attention. Professional in the way that professional things are professional, through the absence of error rather than the presence of technique. They watched it from the window. Neither of them reached for a phone. "They don't want us to know they're out there," Marcus said. "They want us to know," she said. He considered that. "They want us to know they can," he said. "Yes." Below, the fire moved into its middle stage. The lot was still empty. Nobody had called it in. After a while, she became aware that Ryn had moved away from the window and was sitting beside her, not watching the fire, but watching her, and she put her hand on his back and felt the even rise and fall of his breathing. The parking garage 2 blocks north was 4 stories of open concrete, the kind of structure that amplifies every sound that enters it and holds the smell of exhaust and cold stone long after the cars have left. She went there at 3 because she needed the car that Marcus had left on the 2nd level, a 3rd vehicle, because the rental was gone and they needed to move before morning. He went with her. Ryn moved between them on the ramp, his nails clicking in a pattern she knew as well as her own breathing. And then the pattern stopped. He didn't break stride into a run. He froze mid-step, one front paw not yet grounded, and the sound that came from him was not a bark and not a growl in the conventional sense. It was something lower, a vibration more than a vocalization, something that originated in his chest and barely reached the air outside his body. She heard it because she had been hearing it for 4 years and knew its register the way you know the sound of a house settling versus the sound of something else. She stopped. Marcus stopped. The figure was 40 feet away, at the junction where the ramp met the second level, standing in the shadow of a support column, not moving, not speaking. Just standing with the particular stillness of someone who had chosen that specific position because it provided sightlines in 3 directions and adequate concealment from all of them. Rin did not advance. He stood between them and the shadow and held his position with the patient, grounded certainty of an animal that understood his job in this moment was not to move. 8 seconds. The figure turned and walked along the far wall toward the east stairwell, unhurried, the footsteps even on the concrete floor, receding in a way that communicated departure rather than retreat. The distinction mattered. Marcus. He was counting. Jessica. He's done counting. They got to the car. She drove. Neither of them said anything else about it. Her phone rang at 10:30 that morning, a number she recognized from the contact card she'd left on Maria Delgado's nightstand 8 days ago, the one she hadn't expected to be used. "I want to talk to whoever needs to hear it," Maria said. Jessica was in the motel room. Rin was at the window. Outside, an ordinary morning was happening to ordinary people in ordinary ways. You understand what that means for the agreement. A silence that lasted long enough to be a decision being made rather than a decision already made. They took something I don't get back. They don't get to keep my silence, too. Another pause, shorter. I want my daughter to know I did this. That's all. Jessica said she understood. She told her she'd make the call to the right person today, that her statement would go directly to a federal prosecutor, that no one in the chain that Merrick occupied would handle it or see it first. Maria said good. She said it the way people say things when they've been waiting to say them for a year and the word itself is smaller than what it contains. She made the call to the DOJ contact at 11. She used her personal phone. She explained what she had: Ryan's device, the email chain, the configuration logs, the maritime records from Marcus's hard drive, Maria's statement, and the name of the federal prosecutor she needed to hand it to directly. Without it traveling through any part of the chain she could no longer account for. The contact said he'd need an hour. She said she had an hour. Merrick arrived at 12:43. Not by text, not by call. In person, which meant he'd tracked the motel through her cell tower ping, which meant he still had the access level that allowed him to do that, which meant he'd made a specific decision about how to use what he had left. She opened the door when he knocked. Rin looked at him from the window without moving. He sat in the chair Marcus had vacated. He put his hands on his knees. He didn't look around the room. "Her name is Claire," he said. "She's 19 now." He said it without preamble because he had clearly decided on the way over that preamble was not going to help either of them. She was 17 when they operated. Summit Ridge. Holt. She'd had back pain for 8 months. She played soccer. She was going to play in college. A pause that he moved through. She doesn't play anymore. Jessica waited. Breen's lawyers made contact 6 months after the surgery. They had the real pre-surgical records, the ones that showed she didn't meet the clinical criteria the tool was supposed to apply. They had the internal communications showing the threshold had been adjusted specifically to capture her demographic. He looked at the floor. They told me if any investigation moved toward Summit Ridge or Access Care, those records would be filed in a way that would prevent any malpractice claim she had from proceeding, and that certain aspects of how I'd handled a previous investigation would become relevant to my personnel file. He said it all at the same pace, in the same register, The way you say something you have rehearsed until it no longer sounds like anything. When Marcus Cole's name appeared in the maritime query, he said, I didn't report it. I didn't tell Breen. I want to be clear about that. I didn't tell Breen. He looked up. But I knew what was in that query, and I said nothing. I know what that is. The name, she said. The person who signed the maritime contracts on Meridian, in international waters. He told her. She wrote it in her notebook. He stood up. He straightened his jacket in the way of a man who has maintained certain habits so long they operate independently of the circumstances around them. He looked at Ryn briefly and then at her. He didn't say he was sorry. She thought that was probably the most honest thing he'd done in 6 months. She let him get to the door. Your daughter, she said. The claim. I'll make sure the filing is structured so her case isn't affected. He stood at the door for a moment without turning around. Then he left. At 2 in the afternoon, she transmitted the package to the DOJ contact. Everything, indexed and encrypted, with the signed statement from Maria Delgado and the maritime contract signatory, and the email chain that put Breen's name on every threshold adjustment for 4 consecutive years. Confirmation came back in 11 minutes. The contact's message said, Received. Secure. Do not transmit anything further through this channel until you hear from me. She set the phone down. Marcus was on the floor with his back against the bed, reading through the financial summary she'd printed that morning. Ryn was between them, stretched on his side across the narrow strip of carpet with the complete boneless ease of an animal that had determined the current situation did not require readiness and had acted accordingly. Marcus looked up. If it's not enough, he said. She looked at Ryn, the slow rise and fall of his side, the way his ears moved once at a sound from the corridor and then settled again when the sound resolved into nothing. Ryn still found you on the water, she said. That's already true. Nothing that happens next changes it. He was quiet for a moment. That's not an answer. No, she said. It's not. He looked at Ryn. Then he closed the document and set it on the floor and leaned his head back against the bed frame with the ease of a man who had learned to sleep when sleeping was available, because experience had taught him that the alternative was to be awake when you needed to be awake and have nothing left. He was asleep in 4 minutes. She timed it without meaning to. At 4 in the morning, the motel was quiet in the way of places that have held a lot of people passing through and have stopped distinguishing between them. Ryn was asleep. Marcus was asleep. Outside, the highway ran its steady current of headlights and taillights, each one going somewhere that had nothing to do with this room. Jessica sat with her back against the headboard and looked at the two of them on the floor and thought, "This is what I have." The thought arrived without weight, without the loneliness she might have expected it to carry. It was a fact, and the fact was sufficient, and sufficient was, at 4 in the morning, in a motel room with a sleeping dog and a sleeping man, whose brother she was going to bring some portion of justice to, enough to keep moving. She did not sleep. She waited for morning to decide it was ready, and eventually it was. The notification came on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, when the city had taken on the particular gray quality that settles over coastal places in winter. Not the hostile gray of the November Atlantic, but a softer, more permanent gray, the gray of things that have decided to wait and are comfortable waiting. Jessica was driving. Ryn was in the back seat, nose lifted toward the 2-inch gap she left open in his window, regardless of the temperature, cataloging whatever the air contained as they moved through it. She read the notification at a red light. 2 lines, the DOJ contact's name, the words, "Arrest warrant executed." She forwarded it to Marcus. She put the phone in the cup holder and drove. His reply came 4 minutes later. A single word. Okay. She understood exactly what the word contained and exactly what it didn't, and she drove the rest of the way to the field office without the radio on. The case that followed was not quick. Federal cases of this construction, 3 investigative threads drawn from a maritime recovery, a deleted audit log, and a server room in a hospital east wing, converging on a single corporate architecture, moved at the pace of something being built to withstand the pressure that would be applied to it, which is the only pace that holds. She was a witness in it, not the lead. She gave her statement 4 times to 4 different attorneys and answered the same questions with the same answers, and learned, over the months that followed, how to sit in a room where process was doing the work and let it. Raymond Holt cooperated with a completeness that the DOJ attorneys described in the careful, neutral language of people who had seen a great many cooperating witnesses as unusually thorough. He named names. He produced records. He explained, in the precise clinical vocabulary of a man who had spent 2 decades in operating rooms, exactly what each threshold adjustment to the clinical pathway optimizer had meant in practice. What categories of patient it had captured that a correctly calibrated system would not have, and what had happened to those patients afterward. His medical license was revoked before the year was out. The plea agreement kept him out of a cell. Whether that was right was a question that had more than one answer depending on who was asking it, and Jessica had stopped expecting questions like that to resolve cleanly sometime in the first year she'd worked healthcare fraud. Maria Delgado gave her statement on a Wednesday afternoon in a DOJ conference room with a window that looked out over a parking structure, which was either a coincidence or not. She spoke for 2 hours in the flat, factual register of someone who has decided that the facts themselves are sufficient and does not need to decorate them. Afterward, she sat in her car in the parking structure for 15 minutes before driving away. And Jessica knew this because she had been parked 2 levels above and had watched her tail lights move toward the exit and had not moved her own car until they were gone. Elena Marsh was identified in January, 41 years old, senior compliance analyst at Axis Care Solutions, the origin point of the anonymous tip that had started all of it. She had flagged the surgical referral configuration internally twice in 14 months through proper channels, and both flags had been reviewed and closed without action, and after the second one she had understood that the channel itself was the problem. She faced her own investigation, not criminal, but the kind of professional accounting that comes when you know something for 14 months, and the question of what you did with what you knew is examined carefully by people whose job is to examine it carefully. There was no clean resolution to that question. She had made the right choice when she made it, and she had made it later than she could have, and both of those things were true at the same time and would remain so. Merrick resigned in February. He cleaned out his office on a Saturday, which meant the building was quiet, which meant he had chosen the day specifically. 3 months after that, on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, he came to her office. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one that Ryan Hartwell had occupied in her imagination for months before he'd stepped out from behind the server rack. Ryn was on his bed in the corner. He looked at Merrick when he entered, a single comprehensive look, and then put his head back down. Merrick said what he had come to say. He had prepared it, she could tell, not in the sense of having made it smaller or easier, but in the sense of having decided what was true and what needed to be said and having removed everything that wasn't either of those things. He talked about Claire. He talked about the 6 months between the Breen lawyer's visit and the morning Marcus Cole's name appeared in a maritime query. He talked about what he had told himself during those 6 months, and he was honest about how insufficient the telling had been, and how he had known it was insufficient while he was telling it. He didn't ask her to say anything. That was the thing she had not expected, that he would come and say what needed to be said and not require her to respond to it, not require her forgiveness or her understanding or even her acknowledgement, just her presence as a witness to the fact that he had finally said it out loud to the person it most needed to be said to. She let him finish. She did not stand up when he stood up. She did not offer her hand. When he reached the door and opened it, Ryn lifted his head and watched him go, and then looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them had anything to add. She sat with it for a while after he left. Then she closed the file she'd had open on her screen and went home. The drive to the town where Danny was buried took Marcus 4 hours on a Sunday in March, through the kind of countryside that exists specifically between places. Not scenic enough to be a destination, not dense enough to be a city. Just land continuing in the way that land continues when nobody has decided yet what to do with it. He found the cemetery without difficulty. It was small, on the edge of town, the kind of place maintained by people who had known the families buried in it long enough that maintenance was not a professional obligation, but a habit of care. He stood at the grave for a while. The air was cold enough to see his breath. He took out his phone. He looked at it for a moment, the screen reflecting the pale March sky, a rectangle of cloud and white. And then he dialed a number he hadn't dialed in 11 months. It rang once, twice, a third time, and in the space of that third ring the cemetery held its silence around him with the particular patience of a place that has absorbed a great deal of waiting and found none of it remarkable. Marcus. His mother's voice came through the way familiar voices come through after a long absence, immediately recognizable and somehow larger than he'd remembered, the sound of something he'd been telling himself he could do without, and had been wrong about in a way that was not painful to be wrong about. He didn't speak for 2 seconds. "Yeah," he said, "it's me." He stayed on the phone for 40 minutes, standing at his brother's grave in the pale Sunday light, and what he said during those 40 minutes belonged to him and to her and to the particular silence of that place, and none of it needed to be anything else. The beach was a small one, an hour south of the city, the kind of beach that exists to be used by people who live near it rather than people who travel to reach it. A parking area, a path through low dunes, a stretch of sand that ran 200 yards between a rock formation to the north and a pier to the south. In April it was empty most mornings before 9. Jessica didn't know who had arrived first. She hadn't asked and Marcus hadn't offered, and when she came over the dune and saw him sitting on the sand looking out at the water, it had the quality of something that had been there before she arrived, rather than something that had just happened. Ryn was not beside her. He had cleared the dune 4 seconds ahead of her and launched himself down the slope toward the water with the specific abandon of an animal that has assessed the situation, determined that the situation contains an ocean, and acted accordingly. His paws hit the wet sand at the water's edge, and he ran along it, parallel to the waves, ears flat in the wind, the full length of him organized around the pure and purposeless joy of running on wet sand near cold water with no one asking him to do anything at all. She sat down beside Marcus, not close, not far, the distance of 2 people who had been through something together and did not need proximity to confirm it. He looked at the water for a while. Then he said, "He always said he was going to learn to surf." He didn't look at her when he said it. It wasn't the kind of thing that required looking at someone. She nodded once. The wave that came in while she did reached farther up the sand than the previous one, touched the edge of the dry zone, and pulled back. They sat. The sun was low enough that the light came at an angle across the water and lit the tops of the small waves from the side, making each one briefly specific before it collapsed and became the next one. Marcus didn't say anything else. She didn't say anything. After a while, she became aware that she wasn't going to, and that this was not a failure, but simply the shape of what this was. 2 people on a beach in April with a dog who had found one of them in the Atlantic and had found the truth of the other by sitting in the cold and looking at a door until someone paid attention. She didn't know when she would see him again. She didn't think about it. It was not a thing that required thinking about right now, and right now was what there was. Ryn came back from the far end of the beach and stopped at the water's edge 10 feet in front of them, chest heaving, tongue out, his attention already on the next wave arriving. When it came, he danced back from it at the last moment, the way he always did, the way he had done since the first time she'd brought him to the ocean, and he'd discovered that waves were a game the water played indefinitely and without keeping score. He gathered himself and ran back the way he'd come, toward the pier, his paws throwing arcs of wet sand, his ears lifting in the wind. She watched him go, black and gold against the pale April sand, the light catching the top of his coat, where the dark gave way to the warm color underneath, all of it moving at the particular speed of an animal that has understood something most things never do, that the running is not in service of anything, that the sand is not a means to an end, that the cold salt air coming off the water and the sound of the waves arriving in their patient indifferent succession are not conditions to be endured on the way to somewhere else, but are themselves the point, entirely, sufficient and complete. He ran the way he did everything, without reservation, without any portion of himself held back for later, because later was not a concept that Rin carried with him into the present moment. And the present moment was all there was, and it was enough. And Jessica Ward watched him and did not think about what came next. There is a woman named Maria who signed a piece of paper that cost her something she will never get back, and then one day she picked up a phone and said, "They don't get to keep my silence too." She didn't do it because she had nothing left to lose. She did it because she understood, finally, that silence given under pressure is not the same as peace, and that the only way to stop carrying a thing is to set it down in the light where other people can see it. There is a man named Ryan who deleted a file because someone told him to and then did not delete the copy. He didn't have a plan. He didn't think of himself as brave. He just couldn't make himself press the button a second time, and that small, quiet refusal, the kind that doesn't feel like anything when you make it, turned out to be the thing that everything else depended on. And there is a man named Marcus who spent 39 hours in the North Atlantic holding on to something he refused to let the ocean take, not because he was certain it would matter, but because the alternative was to let go. And letting go was the one thing he had decided before the water got cold enough to make decisions for him that he was not going to do. None of them were heroes in the way we talk about heroes. They were people who, at specific moments, made specific choices under conditions that made the easier choice very easy indeed. And those choices, small and frightened, and sometimes made in the dark without knowing why, added up to something that could not be undone. Rin didn't know any of that. He found a man on the water because something in the air told him to look down, and he looked. He sat beside a server rack in a cold room because something behind it needed to be found, and he sat. He ran on the beach in April because it was morning, and the sand was wet, and the waves were coming in, and there was nothing else required of him. He never waited to understand why before he acted. He just followed what he sensed, and trusted it, and stayed. Most of us spend a long time learning to do what he did without thinking about it. If this story found you today, I think you already know what it's asking of you. The small choice you've been putting off. The silence you've been keeping that belongs to someone else now. The thing you've been holding on to in cold water that you haven't let yourself believe is worth holding. It's worth holding. If someone in your life needs to hear that today, a friend who is tired, a family member who has been quiet too long, someone who is 39 hours into something hard, share this with them. Drop a comment and tell me, what is the one thing you refuse to let go of? I read every one, and if you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories coming, and some of them I think are exactly the ones you need right now.